sorry.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody in the room and also in the online. It's our great pleasure to have our speaker today, Dr. Miguel Lim, old friend of mine and colleague. We are working on this higher education research in the same field for a long time together. He has a very busy agenda during this Hong Kong visit, and he will fly to Bangkok tomorrow, as far as I understand. And then in Hong Kong, he's visiting several universities to attend the conferences and give seminars, many academic events. But I grabbed him, you're in Hong Kong, you should drop by Hong Kong.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
So I'm so grateful for you to make this time for us here. Well, Miguel Lim, he is a senior lecturer in the Manchester University in the UK. He's also REF, if you're familiar, maybe you can explain what REF means later, rep coordinator, and also the co-convener of the Higher Education Research Network in Manchester Institute of Education. And he's specialized with the research internationalization of higher education, especially this Southeast Asian higher education. And he's the person who can really talk about internationalization and higher education in Southeast Asia. So it's a great pleasure. Miguel, we have 1 hour. Feel free to speak for your presentation, and we will have a Q&A and discussion.
Yeah,
right?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jisun. It was great to, of course, for inviting me, for insisting that I come here. I just want to say she did not have to insist very hard because I wanted to come, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for reaching out. I met and had a quick chat with some of your students, so I know that Jisun mentioned that we can have some Q&A at the end, but it's not a very big group, so feel free as well to ask any questions within the presentation. Very glad as well that usual and possibly other colleagues are online, so that applies as well to colleagues online. So, oh, sorry, do you want me to use this? I guess it's better for the online colleagues. Yeah, so glad to be here to talk about particularly Southeast Asia. I had a version of this given the time as well. I was just teaching at the University of Bath to a group of PhDs who were actually doctorate in business administration, so DBA students in higher education management. And there I used 2 case studies. That's why the title is East and Southeast Asia. So I and my team have done some work on these higher education partnerships, particularly with China, but also in Southeast Asia. And that's the kind of topic or the region that I would like to speak to you more about today. Also to remind me about what I have to think about on my way to Bangkok tomorrow. So just a little bit of context really that I will give there. First of all, about myself and the field. I'll explain why. And then to talk about the concepts that I'll be using. So it's like kind of like academic flavor of this session, although as I mentioned, it stems a lot from policy work that I'm doing. So the concepts aren't very, very complicated really, but I did want to, we are at the University of Hong Kong, and that's I think what you're dealing with here in your program. But it is a policy related kind of, study or field, but I would like to introduce you to some concepts that I'm using and then to apply them to this specific space in Southeast Asia, higher education partnerships between Southeast Asia and its external partners, and then personal reflections as being part of that policy space. So to kind of like after the application to understand my role there. And why do I say that? So regarding the kind of researcher context of positionality. So I was telling Jisun, or like we've known each other for a long time, but I was recounting again, like, oh, kind of like the different academic disciplines that we have been trained in. So, and it's also been, I was also reminded of that in the Lingnan conference, speaking to different people, how we got to our current positions, where we came from. And my first degree was in molecular biology. Because my father was a good, like Asian family. I'm originally from the Philippines, and he was very interested in Europe, in politics and history. But the pragmatic, like father in him said, I think you should try to do something more difficult. I think he wanted me to be a lawyer maybe, or a doctor, medical doctor, which is, like a very good profession in the Philippines. So I did molecular biology, but I moved from biology. I realized that that was not what I wanted to do. So now I'm a different kind of doctor. I hope he's not disappointed. But I moved from biology to economics, and really from economics to what I would call economic sociology, possibly economic anthropology. So from economics, of course, you have a sense of, okay, like this is how to maximize efficiency. So there are right answers. It's very clear, like what kind of, how many, I don't know, how many dollars do you need to achieve the best results, and so on and so forth. But I've moved more and more into qualitative research, particularly, well, I was trained, for instance, by an education anthropologist, Sue Wright, from Oxford, in education anthropology or policy anthropology, which is really about, okay, your perspective and your kind of worldview, your theoretical lens really affects the kind of what you see in the field. So, so the difference, I guess, in, like moving to policy studies is that, for instance, in this room, someone who is kind of like a classical political scientist would say that if you sit down here, if you observe who is talking, then we should all come to the same conclusion about who is the most powerful person. Meaning, it's a person standing up in front who's speaking the most, he or she is the most powerful. But I think the more qualitative social scientists will say, depending on where you sit, you might have a different answer to the question about who is the most powerful person. If you're, say, if you're a man or a woman, or say, of a white ethnicity or an Asian, and so on and so forth. So I am from the global south. I am from Southeast Asia, and for the longest time, so I maybe haven't really expressed that so clearly. But in the UK now, for the last couple of years, really this dialogue of decolonization, issues about epistemic justice and injustice are really stronger and stronger. So this quote unquote issue of the global south, global majority, or to use the UN term, G77 in contrast to the G7, is very important, right? So I am from this region and I kind of want to understand, right, this region. I think coming from the region will help you to understand my views about partnerships within the region, and when the region is, when higher education institutions in Southeast Asia partner with, say, universities in Manchester or the UK or the US or elsewhere. Yeah? Even though and I was a student, an international student, and I'm currently a, like a, professor or whatever in the global north. Yeah. And I'm very mindful of that. So my professional experience, so like I've worked in a variety of careers, right? But I have worked in management in higher education. So I was managing these international flows of students. So I was working for a French university, a quite elite French university. I was working for an elite UK university in London, and in a way, somehow Manchester has its own kind of prestige. So although I don't work in quote unquote professional services there, I sometimes deputize for our Office of International Relations. So I'm working not just as an academic studying international partnerships, but sometimes I'm also in a position of management in international partnerships. And that also affects the way that I see the issues that I will share with you today. And in particular, at the kind of, related to the topic I'm speaking about today, I'm the lead technical expert for the ASEAN Secretariat, right? Particularly on, ASEAN has a directorate on education, youth, and sport, right? And under the education part, one of the big projects is internationalization of higher ed, which I'll speak about later. And I'm the lead technical expert there for a variety of policy initiatives, right? Which I'll mention later on. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in economic sociology. So I've moved from quote unquote molecular biology, from the kind of hard positivist side of the of academia to slightly more kind of like critical realist, social constructivist kind of perspectives. So I did my PhD on university rankings, which like I think many people are very interested in. And well, actually not on university rankings, but on university rankers, the organizations and the persons and the individuals who are making them, because I'm very interested in how people create value. What kinds of value? I don't think that value is just natural or taken for granted. So for instance, the value of a higher education, I think, is highly constructed, socially constructed. And so for instance, the construction via university rankings, right? These numbers, right, like are proxies, right? Like they claim for excellence in higher ed. And again, right, like I think we really need to think carefully about what those numbers mean and whether those numbers really are a good measurement of excellence in higher education. And I know that many of you already have read perhaps the literature on the criticism of rankings, but I think it's worth repeating that, yeah, like, I mean, these criticisms exist, but nevertheless, even though these criticisms exist, we allow them, most of us, including academics, so we should not absolve ourselves. We allow them to rule the decisions that we make with regard to the partners that we choose. You know, when you look at the applicant, for instance, of a PhD, you know, like applicant, or to think about like, oh, should I work with this person? Is he or she working in a quote unquote prestigious university? I was just telling Jisun that, for instance, we are, you know, like we have, Manchester has a strategic partnership. So regardless of the person, as long as you work with people from, say, certain universities, Hong Kong, Manchester will give us money. But if not, then no money. Is really ridiculous, right? But as I said, these are all constructed, right? Like, I mean, the numbers in university rankings have been criticized by so many people, and nevertheless, they are valorized. So, you know, there are institutions, to use some frameworks that Professor Chai is very, you know, like familiar with. There are kind of like social institutions around these numbers that make them hard or strong, right? And anyway, I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in kind of like the practice, theorizing the practice of internationalization. So the academic board of, for instance, the Center for Higher Education Internationalization, which is more for practitioners who are doing PhDs in, it's based in Italy, and an editor of a practice-based journal, International Higher Education Policy and Practice. And I kind of like I am on the editorial board of several journals, including some kind of policy-based journals like Policy Reviews in Higher Ed, Higher Education Quarterly, which think more about policies. I'll skip this. I won't really go into this field. I think you already know because you're all students of higher ed, so you know the field. You might not know as much about me, but you know the field of international higher ed. You know that there's a literature about world-classness and rankings. You know there's a literature in international higher ed about international students and their experiences, about the internationalization of the curriculum, about research collaboration, you know, and the patterns in research collaboration, both the bibliometrics, right? Like, I mean, the quote unquote quantitative analysis of this, as well as the, you know, like, qualitative analysis. There have been some people who say, okay, like asking people, why do you choose to work with so-and-so in this country, in that country? And then there's also the political side. So either science or knowledge diplomacy, which is another factor related to partnerships. So there are a variety of literatures that we can use to understand partnerships, why certain institutions or even certain countries partner with each other in the field of higher ed. And some of those answers or some of those hypotheses can be gained from some of these subject areas in the field of higher ed. And of course, some of these papers are from political science, from psychology, you know, like student experiences. There's this like education psychology literature or sociological literature. There's a bit of pedagogy and kind of education pedagogy literature and so on and so forth. Yeah. Okay, and then well, you might be also familiar with this literature, whether policy or theoretical literature, on the global South element of this field, meaning the world-class university initiatives. You know, there are lots of histories that have been written about, say, the Project 985, 211, Double First Class. And of course, this is not just in China. This has been repeated. I think I saw this slide, I don't know whether it's you show, Professor Chai or some others who showed the Korea plan. And, you know, this is all over Russia, the Russia 5100 plan, the Brazil plan. So in the Global South, there are a lot of these like world-class initiatives, which generally place the Global North in the kind of leading position. So 10 years ago, I wrote a is it a book chapter, an article about, I asked the question of, the Asia, whether Asia is the next higher education superpower. That was the title of the book. My contribution said that, well, if the Shanghai rankings, so I kind of explained that the methodology of the Shanghai rankings, this is how it measures the distance from the quote unquote top American university to all other universities. So the Shanghai rankings basically express quantitatively a university's excellence as a percentage of Harvard. So if you look at the Shanghai rankings, you look in more or less all of they're not so many, right? Like methodological numbers, right? Harvard scores 100 in almost all the elements. And then the other universities are expressed as a fraction of that. So Stanford is, I don't know, whatever, 90% of Harvard and so forth. Anyway, so more or less it's a simplification explanation of this instrument. So these world-class initiatives are all about like closing that distance. You know, the one way of course, there are many papers, but you know, this is one interpretation. And in other words, the answer to the question of whether whether Asia is the next higher education superpower under those circumstances is, of course, the answer is no, and it will never be if Asia is always and only expressed as a fraction of like if we say, how close can we get to Harvard? If that is the initial premise, then no other institution or no other country can ever be a superpower, right? Unless it's clear to us that, okay, we should express Harvard and everyone else as a fraction of, say, Beta or whatever, Tsinghua. So these general trends mean that, okay, that the flows normally, right, this is more empirical literature, from south to north and east to west. So even though that's empirical in the sense of the numbers, the knowledge about it is also in that direction, even though there's been more work now about, say, African or Global South and African students here in China, and a little bit of European students in kind of in China as well. Even though there's growing knowledge about the interests and importance of the Global South partners. So one of my contentions here is that the reason why I say this is because, because I want us to understand that partnerships, it's almost obvious to say, right, like involve at least two parties, right? Like, I mean, at least when you have a partnership, you normally have, like, for instance, Yushukai has a special issue in Sino-foreign partnerships. You have a Sino side, Chinese side, and then you have a foreign side. So at least you have two elements. And so we cannot just understand partnerships if we only deeply understand one side of the partnership. So we need to understand the other side. And what this literature shows us is that in many cases, we either understand only one element of one side. So we only understand, oh, China, like say China or the Global South wants to catch up. And on the other side, there's a lot of literature about the internationalization strategies of when you have student recruitment, for instance, of the Global North. We say that, oh, okay, right, like Lucas Graf, for instance, writes about the strategies of British and German universities with regard to how they internationalize. And, you know, like this, the quote unquote host countries are well understood in terms of hosting students and academics. And then on the other side, we mostly understand why China sends students and, say, academics to the quote unquote Global North. That's changing, but the kind of like the trend has been there's more knowledge in those areas. So hopefully we can understand partnerships better, deepen our knowledge of these multifocal interests and of Global South dynamics, including, you know, possibly the desire to understand and expand Global South to South flows of students as well as of academics, to study the differences between quote unquote foreign and local understandings of international AG partnerships, and determine what, if any, are the understandings of equal partnerships, and to think about the strategic and ethical implications of this. So these conceptual notes, as I mentioned, so it's really, not too complicated. So Jonas Stier is again kind of a cultural studies scholar based in Sweden. So he writes more from an intercultural perspective. on many things, but like he has this more philosophical take on internationalization in education. And what I find more interesting is, he describes internationalization in kind of at least 3 ways: as a state of things, or like a description of, okay, this is what it is, like can describe this process as international or internationalized process, or a doctrine. And I find the last part really very, very interesting, because as I mentioned, I'm very interested in how people believe value into being, right? So when we have doctrines, I like this metaphor that internationalization is a form of belief. So when is internationalization of belief? And what will that say about partnerships? So he says that internationalization can be a belief in at least 3 ways, right? It can have 3 kinds of beliefs about internationalization. The first is that international education, rather. So he says we can have 3 beliefs about international education. The first is that internationalization is a good in itself. Internationalization. So we take the first part of the word, international education. So international is a good in itself. So the more we have of it, the better. It doesn't matter if it costs anything, but because right now, for instance, there's a literature in global citizenship education, which says that, okay, like the global commons, the environment, like this is not the prerogative of only one country, but of all countries. So we should all participate in global citizenship education. We should not be nationals, or we should not only be national citizens, but we should aspire to international goods, and we can only solve the big problems of the world by being international, right? So more internationality is a good in itself, because all goods and all problems and challenges are international. And then the second is education is a good in itself. So again, you don't count the cost of education. So this is very much in the tradition of the German political economic philosophy about education, which is that education is a public good. The more educated the population is, the better at societal level and at individual level. So this idea of German Bildung. So Bildung is a kind of German word that means self-development. And so every person, because of his or her nature, should be developed and therefore requires education. So education is a good in itself, and we should have more of it. Yeah? And the last is that international education is just a means to an end. So that it is not a good in itself, but it is a means to something else, right? And of course, I think that when you construct something for another end, you instrumentalize it. And that's what I would like to discuss today, right? Like international higher education partnerships as a means to an end. And I think for the most part, or maybe it's because my previous economic background, I'm sympathetic to this explanation, right? It's not a very complicated explanation. It's just that, okay, we think that international HE partnerships can help us to achieve something. So, and as I said, if you think about it in this way, then what you do is that you go to international partnerships and say, what is the interest of both partners? And as I already said, there's a lot of scholarship on the interests of the sender or of the dominant partner and less on the receiver. And that there's an opportunity to contribute more knowledge or more understanding in the areas of South to South higher education mobilities for students and for researchers, and to understand these transnational HE partnerships. As I mentioned, this is just to talk about the gap. Lucas is a friend, so he knows, besides it's an old paper, he knows my criticism of this piece, that, okay, you study these kind of British and German strategies, and again, there's no mention of their, like, it's just that they, as if Britain internationalizes into the void, right? Like when Britain has an international strategy, I think, at least for me, right? Like it requires there to be an audience for this strategy, not just that you understand the strategy. Of course, you can look at on the document that's produced by Britain, but you don't just internationalize. I mean, you internationalize because you have a kind of international audience. I thought that like this was a fault of the paper, that you speak about internationalization and you only analyze let's analyze the international strategy of the US, and you just read all the US documents. Okay, maybe that's the first step, but you don't internationalize in a vacuum, because by definition, Internationality is you have to understand the relations inter two nations, between two or more nations, right? And therefore, you will need to understand institutional complementarity and comparative institutional advantage, because you must describe at least two partners with an international strategy, and cannot just say, well, this is what Britain does, and this is what the British documents say, and then that's it. So this is the internal logic of Britain. I mean, okay, it makes a limited contribution, but I think that, you know, to study definitely partnerships, we need an understanding of the receiver. So we discussed, for instance, this, I mean, you know, like Lucas had used this varieties of capitalism just to say that, for instance, okay, the way that they explained how Britain internationalizes is that it uses the market, right? Like it's a market logic of internationalization. So it internationalizes into places where it can make a profit, right? Like, or where there's demand for its services, right? There's a demand for its education. So it's just to say that higher education, the higher education sector doesn't exist separately from its political and social and economic environment. You know, it's not, higher education in Britain, British universities exist in the British context of a market economy. Britain it has been described as a liberal market economy, and British universities exist in that political environment, right? And German economies or Finnish economies or Chinese universities also exist in their own political environment, and that they don't exist outside of that. So they function with this national logic. Yeah. And of course, we can go a little bit further. So in another paper, we try to argue that, okay, while this is a first step, even within countries, you can sometimes have different varieties of governance or varieties of capitalism within a country. But that will help us to understand, that will help us at least to understand that, okay, both the sender, for instance, or both partners, whether sender or receiver or partner one and partner two, have these governance contexts, or quote unquote variety of capitalism contexts, and that will help us to see whether they can work together or not. And we use this to understand, for instance, we looked at, say, the Sino-British College, which is a partnership of British universities with a university in Shanghai. And then we looked at it to describe the Sino-Danish Center, which is a partnership of the 8 public universities in Denmark with Beijing, and to show that, okay, to just kind of simplify the argument that we were saying, that even within China, you have a variety of quote unquote capitalism or economic governance in Beijing that is different from Shanghai. And that means it affects the way that it affects the way that China and Denmark cooperate in higher education when the partnership is in Beijing, or when the like Sino-foreign universities in Beijing, and that's different from this British partnership in Shanghai. You get the point? Because there's a kind of like meeting and a kind of like complementarity, right? Like it doesn't mean that you cannot have partners with different modes of governance, but you just need to keep that into account. But it's also the case that, the partnerships that seem to be interesting or have more longevity, that endure more, seem to have these institutional complementarities. This is a little bit more about like at the institutional level. So this is more management side. You can have these issues that affect the partner and the partnership. So this is slightly more, like for managers. This is still from my slide from the doctorate in business administration. So we can come back to this if you want. If you want to manage partnerships, we can talk about this topic. But maybe let's just go to the Southeast Asian part because of the time. So, okay, with those ideas and concepts in mind, right? Like, again, let me talk to you a little bit about our own research. First of all, about the ASEAN region in general, and then I'll try to later on reflect on what those concepts mean, or at least attempt, because as I said, it's 5 o'clock. My brain is very tired. I don't know if I will succeed or not. But anyway, I'll tell you about the research that we do in Southeast Asia, and then see if I can or attempt to apply those concepts to this work that we did. So we did this policy and document analysis. Actually, now we've expanded. We've actually done 200 something interviews. I mean, not I by myself, right? I have a team in Southeast Asia in each country doing this. And we've had a variety of funders, which again helps me to understand what are the interests of various institutions like the EU, the European Union, why it is commissioning certain research and why it is supporting certain kinds of partnerships between European and ASEAN universities via the EU Share project, DAAD, this is the German Academic Exchange Council, the British Council, which is the British education kind of aid organization, the ASEAN Secretariat, the Asia-Europe Foundation. So yeah, ASEAN is, I don't know if, can I just ask, are you familiar with this organization? No? Okay. So it's an organization of, it's a political organization, although a weak one, well, calculated weakness, I would say, consisting of 10 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Brunei, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. So not so far from where we are, right? Like, for instance, when I flew here from Manila, it was a 1.5-hour flight. They agreed to accept Timor-Leste as the next member. They have this similar to Europe, at least in name, although not in, certainly not in terms of resources, or in terms of, I would say, like real political commitment, but they have a document and a charter that says that they will form a political and security community, an economic community, and a social cultural community, just to say that the region is supposed to become more integrated and to have more exchange. Yeah, they agree to not interfere with each other, meaning to respect the sovereignty of the different countries. So this means that it is a different organization from Europe. But in general, what we can say in terms of at least, I don't know, just to give you an idea of the scale and also to tell you a little bit about why it is important, say, for European partners or say North American partners, is because as a region, this is the third largest source of international students. Yeah. So China is the largest globally. Although I saw these latest figures that came out of the US, that now the largest number of international students in the US are from India. So for many, many years it was China, and just recently now it's India is the largest number of international students in the US. But I think overall, China still sends a larger number of students abroad in the world. And then India, and then this region, so the ASEAN region. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are this variety of countries. You have like these numbers there. That number is 350,000. There are 12 million university students in Southeast Asia. Of course, the region is over 600 million people. I think it's close to 700 million now. So some countries are still growing fast in terms of population, although overall there's beginning to be this demographic dip. So we can go into that. We wrote a very long and comprehensive report about reviewing higher education policies in this region. But there are 12 million students, university students in this region, over 350,000 students, international students who go outside every year. 91%, at least according to the statistics that were available, which it was not a complete data set, but 91% go outside the region. So only 9% of those international students stay. And that's why I am kind of like, I and my team are being asked to see how we can improve, what kind of mechanisms, what kind of policies we can do to improve intra-regional mobility and to kind of maybe, you know, it's too simplified, but at least to address the brain drain problem of this region. So again, there are a variety of issues here. There is one of the biggest issues is really that there is such a big difference between the poorest parts of this region and then the most developed parts. So like say Singapore and Laos People's Democratic Republic, or I was just with a colleague a while ago. He's now a postdoc at Lingnan University. He's from Myanmar, from what was once known as Burma. I mean, digital divide, access to digital technology is one. When, you know, we're talking about like higher education resources and also preparation for work or research capacity, you know, that Singapore is practically universal access to higher education, universal access to technology, like higher education technology, internet platforms, and so on and so forth. Whereas in Laos, only I think 13% access higher education, even though as a region, higher education participation has increased from less than 10% to over 35%. So there's a massification of higher ed in the region, right? That's one of the big overall trends for this region. Yeah. So I and my team have written a kind of big policy review that is being used as a roadmap for this region. And in particular, we're also writing the kind of proto-Erasmus plan. So we have done a feasibility study for the intra-ASEAN scholarship policy. Basically a kind of Erasmus policy for the region to offer scholarships for students from one country in the region to study in another country. And as I mentioned, right, like when ASEAN policymakers, so our understanding of ASEAN policies, when they talk about internationalization, they talk about mostly international student mobility, interregional collaboration, because many of the partners are, as I mentioned, outside the region. So partners with the US, with the EU, and with China. Sorry, so this is a challenge for you to read because of the font color, but for instance, CAFTA, ASEAN EU, Asia Europe, and ASEAN +3. These are the partnership mechanisms, the political partnership mechanisms. CAFTA is China, ASEAN Free Trade Area. ASEAN EU is ASEAN and European Union. ASEM is Asia Europe meeting. ASEAN +3 is ASEAN plus China, Japan, and Korea. And then finally, there have been legal changes in the laws of these countries that allow some countries to have branch campuses, to give the legal possibility for transnational higher education, or kind of joint campuses, foreign campuses to operate. So, and the state of the art is that in August they had a declaration towards a common higher education space, right? This means that they want to unify the higher education space in Southeast Asia to allow students to transfer from one country to another, to standardize, at least in principle, what a master's is, what an undergraduate is, basically to turn it similar to a space like the European higher education space, so that students and researchers can move and some skilled labor can move, because that is another question. Of course, the other changes here in this context are that geopolitics is playing a bigger role, and that external partners, so this is about partnerships, are pushing ASEAN in different ways. So kind of the developments in ASEAN, because as I mentioned, ASEAN has few resources at the regional level. So the nations have different resources, but at the regional level, ASEAN is using money from other countries to push its own policies. So these scholarships, like to help students from one country to another, there will be a small number that will be supported by the ASEAN Secretariat, but in many cases, it's funded by, say, the European Union. Like the European Union wants ASEAN to, well, it's giving ASEAN, or at least in the last funding round from 2015 to 2022, funded these scholarships, because Erasmus is a quote-unquote successful model, and I think part of our analysis is that the EU wants ASEAN to demonstrate that its mechanisms and its models can be successfully applied in other regions and territories. And in a way, it's the same for the UK has its own similar interests. The UK wants to be a kind of global leader in equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it is funding a lot of research about equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education in the region. And when you fund research about something, then you create the problem, you make certain problems visible. So our research, so we were asked to also understand demographics. And obviously there are issues about, between rural and urban areas, or between, say, in some cases, gender inequalities. You would be surprised though that there are differences. Like actually in Thailand, the problem is that the girls are so far ahead of the boys. That is the equity, diversity, inclusion there. But anyway, the point is that the British Council is funding all of this research because Britain has those quote-unquote solutions. And Britain is seen, or wants to be seen, as a leader in these equity, diversity, and inclusion policies, like Race Equality Charter, Athena Swan Gender Equality Charter. So it suddenly says, look, you guys in Southeast Asia, you have these problems and we have the solutions, right? Of course, the problems, yes, I mean, they might be there, but now research through, say, research that the universities do or independent consultants like myself do, we bring those problems into, we make those problems visible, and then suddenly, oh, and now we can help you, right? Like Britain, we have the solutions and we have the policies and we have the consultants and we have the experts who can help you to have better equity, diversity, and inclusion. Or we have the experts, like the Europeans now are saying, I'm a consultant for a project now. I mean, I guess, I don't know. Yes, this is being recorded. But anyway, so so I am a consultant now and looking at the European qualifications framework. The Europeans have already done a lot of work to standardize higher education in the European countries. And now they are asking us to see what is the situation in Southeast Asia. And of course, the situation in Southeast Asia is that there is a lack of this standardization. And of course, if there's a lack of this standardization, then the European model is a potential solution to this lack of standardization and so on and so forth. And again, it's the same story for the US, Japan, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I just want to, in this world, I just want us to reflect on, and I don't have the answers necessarily, about, again, going back to my earlier point about this instrumentalism of partnerships, right? Like, okay, we might understand what I'm guessing, or I'm giving you an idea of what are the interests of the, say, the global North partner. But now on the side of ASEAN, let's reflect on what are ASEAN's interests. And ASEAN is also a regional body. What are the ASEAN member states' interests? What are the university interests? Yeah. What are their strengths and what are their reputational strengths? Because a strength and a perceived strength are two different things. What are the win-wins? What are the trade-offs, right? I knew that this would be a seminar and a workshop, and I don't know, maybe you may know something about these countries or not, but at least I propose some of these questions that we need to think about when we think about this quote unquote, what is ethical in a partnership? Because I'm not saying that ASEAN doesn't benefit from the things I mentioned earlier, from these issues that I mentioned earlier. No, there are clear benefits for this particular region. Just as in any partnership, the partnerships that last are because we construct a win for both sides. And now it's about like, oh, how do you construct those wins, right? I'd mentioned this already about Southeast Asia, right? Like we know that most of the students from Southeast Asia leave the region to go to other places. But within Southeast Asia, we know that, like say, Malaysia is a popular destination for the Indonesians, and Thailand is a popular destination for those from Myanmar and from Cambodia. So, okay, we know those things. Are these patterns fixed? Meaning, will Southeast Asian students always go to the global North? Is it possible to increase the proportion of intra-ASEAN students or South-to-South flows? How? Like what kind of partnerships or what kind of resources will be needed for that? And what role will these HE partnerships play, right? So I've answered, in a way, some of those questions via this feasibility report. So I'm just mindful now of time. This is my last slide. So there are a variety of interests at various levels. Sorry, that should be a V. So institutional, national, and regional. There are a variety of external partners who bring various resources to partnerships in higher education with ASEAN. It helps us then to think about, when we think about these external partners and their interests, it helps us to think about internationalization as an instrument to an end. Partnerships sometimes form due to interests on one side, but the sustainability of these partnerships depends on the resolution of collective action dilemmas on the part of both partners, or on the part of, for instance, like ASEAN as a set of partners, because of divergences in interest due to these different political structures and levels of development, or as I mentioned earlier, these varieties of capitalism, varieties of governance. And then also, I also thought that, although this one is, I'm trying to think more about this, the role of policy entrepreneurs or individuals needs to be carefully considered, because as I mentioned, even though I'd spoken about like these kind of more structural issues, when I'm out there in the field, sometimes I notice that it's actually core people, it's individuals who make those partnerships possible. Like even at the national level, as long as there's one person who's friends or who gets along with this other person from another country, somehow they make it work, even though they don't have the same model of governance. So I find that very interesting. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we did this study in China and I showed this Sino-Danish center, right? Like kind of like a political model and a political model together, and the Sino-British center in Shanghai, right? So in a way, like you could say that, oh, that's like a structural model. But I've also seen partnerships where the models of governance are different, but the persons were able to, you know, they were friends, so they made a partnership. So I have to think about, there are theories about that, like the role of policy entrepreneurs, which, you know, like international partnership is still an instrument to an end, but it's not about structure, but about specific agents or entrepreneurs. And that's also something that I'm seeing, and I have to reflect on how to do that. So this is work in well, you know, the policies are in progress and our analysis of these policies are in progress, and my professional involvement is also in progress. Here are some of the policy reports and a few of the academic papers that I've written in kind of reflecting on these. And I'd love to engage with the floor about them as well.
Thank you. Would you like to see?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's better for the discussion, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Oh, thank you so much. And then, well, I welcome any questions and comment from the audience and online as well. Anyone would you like to start?
No?
I start. Well, when I'm waiting for the questions, but maybe I can start. You know, there are always this kind of pessimistic view of this ASEAN collaboration, regional mobility, compared to Erasmus programs, language differences, number one, and geographical distance, number two, cultural differences. I see much more like negative, pessimistic views than potentials. So I wonder how these policymakers consider the kind of negative, pessimistic view, whether they really believe there will be solution to solve the kind of language, culture, religion, geographical distance, etc. What's their view of that real challenges that we can easily solve?
You know, very interesting that, you know, in politics or in political science, you know that there's a term, you need to be eternal optimists in
Yeah.
politics. In the practice of politics, you need to be internally optimistic, right? Politics is about the art of the quote unquote, the possible rather than the art of the feasible. Maybe that's one idea. I mean, sometimes, you know, like public administration is about reality, but sometimes political science, or at least public policy, is about the world of the possible. So even though definitely those realities exist, but the policies, they have to focus on, even though you have to identify the challenges, you have to say what is possible. Sorry, anyway, but you were saying that, do the politicians really believe it is possible? Probably not, because they are not willing to, and that's why it's a collective action problem. So they're not willing to also, because of these collective action problems, they're not willing to put resources forward. Also because of this inequality, some countries have more resources than others. But just to give you a very concrete example of something that that happened, is that, okay, these are you know, like differences, but we proposed 4 models. We thought about, you know, like these scholarships to improve mobility. And those models, think of them like in a 2x2 quadrant, right? Like we thought on one side about the resource required for the scholarship scheme, basically a low cost Erasmus and a high, Erasmus is by definition high cost. So a high cost scheme and then a low cost scheme, which is just kind of information about existing scholarships or to really establish them. And then the mode of governance, will this be top down or bottom up? Will you kind of organize this at the top level or at the bottom? Anyway, the point is that Malaysia immediately said, we will fund the low cost option. Like very fast, because they already have a plan. And they think that, oh, by marketing this, Malaysia stands to gain, because Malaysia is already better positioned within the region. Malaysia stands to gain. If there will be a regional Erasmus, Malaysia will be one of the winners because it is relatively advanced. It already has TNHE players. So it's willing to invest. So can it happen? Yes, because to some extent, because there are some actors that are already interested. So maybe the others will not fund it, but as I mentioned, right? Like, I mean, people are pessimistic in some senses because they don't see a lot of cooperation. But the ones who see that they stand to make some gains are more optimistic. Now, whether, depending on what you mean by success, that's an empirical question. Will we raise that proportion from, say, 9% to a higher percentage? Is another question. Let me think about whether that will happen. So again, like the policy report, again, you're writing it for an audience, right? Like you have to tell the policymaker what is possible. And again, if you tell them that it's hopeless, then, well, yeah, then there's no point.
What's just one follow-up question? What's the really policy priority? Is it student mobility or like research partnership or?
Student
it
mobility
includes
is,
everything.
student mobility is the one because it is the cheaper, it is the more achievable. It is the more achievable one, and it is linked as well to the political goal of having an ASEAN political identity. And again, I don't know if this will be achieved, but the hypothesis is that if Southeast Asians visit other Southeast Asian countries, they will develop a Southeast Asian cultural and political identity, that we will understand, oh, you know, like it's very interesting, Thailand or whatever, or Brunei, and oh, we are part of the same region and we have this regional identity. So there's a political idea there as well that is, you know, like research is really about, I think with research, the trend, as you know, just like in student mobility, is the Southeast Asian researchers are researching with Global North partners and Hong Kong, because they're trying to solve functional issues. Right, and so I think that will continue.
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, there is one question in the online. Yeah, what do you think are the attractions that draw students to the South? The last question.
Well, the South is a big. The South is a big. Thank you so much, Tang Li, for the question. So the South is a big term, but of course, I'm guessing you mean Southeast Asia. So again, I'm thinking about, you know, the Malaysian enthusiasm for this. I think it depends. Different countries are positioning themselves in different ways. Like when we did this policy analysis, one of the suggestions among the policymakers, the stakeholders, was that, oh, this is a chance for us to highlight what each country is known for. So just to give you for instance, to talk not necessarily the global South, but to talk about Erasmus, which is, you know, this student mobility program in Europe. Guess which university is the most popular destination university in Europe? Can any of you guess? Sorry. Britain? Okay, well, Britain was part of it before. Why do you think that?
Because many students will go to Britain for the further education.
Okay.
Like,
Why would they go there for further education?
their resources and the teaching quality and the ranking.
And the rankings. Okay, very good hypothesis. Very good. So highly ranked, you know, good reputation, and so forth. Yeah. Any other ideas?
Italian?
Why do you say Italy, Jisun?
Fashion or like, I mean, we're talking about like European students who who pays less attention to the ranking.
Yeah,
like
so
culture.
interesting that you make that
Yeah.
distinction, yeah? So you're right. Well, it's not Italy, but it's the University of Granada in the south of Spain.
Oh, okay.
Granada is a very beautiful city,
Very
and Spain
beautiful.
has an excellent reputation for food, for good weather, for fun, for nightlife, all the things that make life wonderful, and why the British go to Spain a lot, not to study, but to live, right? And again, so the Thailand people said, well, people may want to come to Thailand, yes, to study in Thailand, but to experience Thailand as a Thailand is just like Spain. It is a tourism superpower, right? And so the others have their own reasons about like why they could be attracted to Malaysia. The Malaysians sometimes, well, I've heard it said that the Malaysians, one of their reputational strategies is to show that they are the most or one of the most modern Islamic countries. They present a different form of modernity, Islamic modernity, right? So at Center for Global Islamic Finance, for kind of religious modernity, religious Islamic modernity. So there could be a variety of reasons. And again, like, I mean, sorry to use my the example of my home country, the Philippines, is a slightly different position. The Philippines, because of its colonial history, the American occupation, and also because of the lower cost of living, because of its level of economic development, is actually attractive as a low-cost English-speaking destination, which is another motivation for this specific global south. So, but there are different reasons, I guess. So it might not be that for the whole global south, but individually. But there was a proposal to say, well, if we try to brand ASEAN as a region, we could emphasize these quote unquote comparative advantages for each country, as an example. Yeah.
Questions? Yeah, Carol, please.
Thank you for your presentation, it's very wonderful. I have a few questions because currently I'm learning in the UK and their series is pretty focused on the how does colonialized culture with I mean like established or create or just formalized the development of the higher education in the modern society. For example, Hong Kong is a post-colonial society, so the structure of the higher education system here is largely influenced by the culture of post-colonial lives. So how do you like see this situation, for example, in Hong Kong or in Philippines or those other countries that have this similar histories?
I don't deny it. So I think that it's as you mentioned, right, like the decolonial movement, the decolonization of the curriculum is very, very important. It leads us also to reflect on the role of power and of the power of the English language, the built-in advantage of the, you know, like Professor Chai told us about like, oh, a European country, the differences in the work ethic of, say, the Finland and of China, where in one part of the world, people are working so hard, and in one part of the world, people don't work, and yet they enjoy and are, you know, like rich, and they can do whatever they want. And on the other hand, you are working, and to some extent, or to, you know, some argue is that that's a result of this kind of colonial extraction and these kind of like historical imbalances. So those are material realities that exist, but material and as well as kind of epistemic or kind of social realities that exist and have very long trajectories and very long histories. So I agree, we have to pay attention to that. We have to really think carefully about correcting those issues. What I would say though is that, again, Britain and say the US are trying to be global leaders in this discourse. They are going to provide the solution as well to decolonization. So decolonization, as we mentioned, it is a problem, right? But the solutions don't seem to come from the colonized countries. Yeah, the solutions are all being offered by the scholars of the North. And my one argument is that I think that even this attention to decolonization is about the interests of the global North, because they want to talk about these things. When I go to some of these Southeast Asian countries, their interests are about technology transfer, right? And about material development. And technology transfer acknowledges that the center of development is in the US and all of that. So in a way, technology transfer is a colonial mechanism. They are interested in that. That's what, in that field, they want that. But colonialism. So I'm not saying that it's wrong, but I think, in my view, it is people in the US and in the UK who are obsessed by this topic and not, so in a way, it is again the agenda, decolonization is the agenda of the global North. To some extent, rather than the agenda of the global South, which it is supposed to help.
My agreement on that. Lisa?
Well, I think probably we are running out of the time, so.
You can ask the final question. Comment.
And he always asks difficult questions. I know this, I know.
ASEAN, you know, the network. So probably you know better how it functions. You mentioned that there are 3 committees. It's really responsible for political, economic, and cultural matters. So I just want to know how the 3 committees coordinate. Because, you know, this look, when you are talking about the influential partner like China, like US, EU, because they are working basically, they are influencing on different dimensions. You know, China is investing, and the US more caring about security issues, and the EU, you know, more
Culture.
broadly culture and also trade. So I think they are driving the basically the different committees in different directions. So I'm wondering how the committee coordinate within ASEAN.
So first of all, I think there are a lot of silos. So it even though it's not this, I mean, the European Union, which of course you are familiar with because you're because of your, you know, just the context that you work in and research and live in, is so big, right? The European Union is so big and well resourced. ASEAN is much smaller, and still, even though it's small, there are these silos, right? Like that sometimes these are not coordinated. And even within one community, as I said, like different partners have different interests, and sometimes projects or activities take place, as I mentioned, because they are funded by an external partner that wants something. So the British Council wants projects about gender diversity and inclusion. So, and say they will do that in the cultural side. So, okay, so there will be some activity, but then China, as you mentioned, like the US probably or China probably want some focus on, say, the security and possibly on the economic side. So the silos is also in a way influenced by the interests of the external partners, because in many cases since ASEAN doesn't have a lot of money internally, right? Like it's money from the outside. Anyway, we can go a little bit. There's a long history trying to understand multi-level governance in Europe and how that applies or doesn't apply in ASEAN, to show how these three communities work. Because in a way, the model is those three communities as they exist in the European Union, right? Those three pillars also exist in the European Union. So that formalized mapping is applied in ASEAN. And I know that in Europe, that is complex, and somehow they also don't integrate so much in Europe, although there's more, because of the money, internal money, there's more coordination. In ASEAN, there's less money. And again, it is more haphazard, you know, like the long-term strategy is not, I would say, so strong, because about the logic of ASEAN. ASEAN, I think, is, even though they say we want to have a common higher education space, we want to have a common regional identity, the origins of ASEAN and the European Union are very different. So the European Union's kind of motivation is as a response to the Second World War, where the European countries fought with each other. So part of my understanding is that the European Union is meant to bind the European countries together so that they don't fight with each other internally. And the ASEAN context is that the ASEAN context was formed in the Cold War, where it's America and the Soviet Union fighting. And ASEAN said, let's come together so that we tell America and the Soviet Union, please don't fight here, fight somewhere else, leave us alone. Like, it's not about their own fight. So so they don't actually, one analysis is that they don't actually want to integrate. They just want others not to interfere so much with their problems. So even though they say these are these three pillars, maybe that's why the security pillar is possibly the most important, because really what ASEAN, quote unquote, wants, according to this logic, is as long as you don't fight here, it's important. So that's why ASEAN tries to balance between the US now and China, right? It's not about ASEAN countries working with each other. That's why there's this non-interference principle, which is not the European principles are about interference in economic matters. This would not happen, I think, in ASEAN.
Yeah, good clarification. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Miguel, for coming to the Hong Kong New today within your really busy schedule. And thank you, everybody, for coming. You know, one of the most terrible weather in Hong Kong of the year, but thank you for coming, and also online participant. If you have any further questions, this is the contact information of the Dr. Lim, so feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much.
And then I hope to see you again in Hong Kong, maybe next year. sometime.
If you promise better weather, of course.
Oh,
I
yeah.
will. And even if the weather's like this, if you promise good Cantonese
Oh,
food, I
of
will
course I
also
do.
come.
Oh, yeah, I will promise you. All right, thank you, everybody, for coming.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Okay. Hey.
Hey, hello.
So let me introduce.
You said you are based in the UK or something, or?
Yes, so she did master here, and then good to see you. She's back, and she finished her education master here.
Excellent.
Now she's studying in the Cambridge and for the
Oh.
master's degree.
Are
That's
you
why.
doing another master's or doing your PhD in Cambridge? And
April,
Phil,
yeah, she moved.
who are you working with?
You know, currently I'm choosing my tutor, trying to, and currently my.
I don't know of a
tutor-
lot of HE people in Cambridge, but
Oh, really? Currently I'm learning HE, right level, like special medicine, KPP, you know KPP? Power knowledge and policy.
okay, so it's slightly,
Yeah, that's very interesting.
slightly different. Which department are you working with?
That's
Then-
the-
Okay, so the education.
And this is Mario, she also finished it.
Nice to, well, no, sorry, we met.
Yeah, and then she's preparing, Carol, yeah.
Carol, okay.
And she's also preparing for the PhD, yeah.
Okay,
I'm a
good.
bit late,
Huh?
because of the weather, I'm a bit
Oh,
late.
no, no, no.
And I'm glad